A ruthless billionaire is wiping the homeless off the streets, using money, power, and corruption to silence anyone who stands in his way. But when he comes for Shaq, he picks the wrong fight. As the city turns against him and betrayal hits close to home, Shaq faces an impossible choice: walk away or take on a system built to crush him. And he's not backing down. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the city of Atlanta, stretching warm fingers across the bustling streets and towering skyscrapers. Shaquille O'Neal, or Big Shaq, as he was lovingly called, stood at the back of a food truck parked beside an old community center in one of the city's forgotten neighborhoods. The air smelled of freshly grilled chicken, warm bread, and rich, seasoned vegetables. A long line of men, women, and children waited patiently, their eyes reflecting the quiet struggle of their daily lives. Shaq, towering over the crowd but never above them, moved with ease, handing out meals with a genuine smile. "Y'all take care now. Don't forget to grab a bottle of water too," he said, his deep voice a mix of warmth and authority. Some people thanked him softly, others with excitement, but all of them left with a sense of dignity, something Shaq made sure to preserve. Despite his millions, his championships, and his legendary status, Shaq was more at home here than in any luxury suite. The streets had always called to him. He had seen what struggle looked like. He had lived it, felt it in the air of his childhood neighborhoods, watched it eat away at families. That was why he was here now, week after week, making sure people didn't go to bed hungry. The local news had covered his efforts before, branding him as Atlanta's gentle giant. But Shaq didn't care for the spotlight. He wasn't here for headlines. He was here because it was the right thing to do. A little girl, no older than 6, reached for a meal, her tiny hands shaking. Her mother, eyes hollow with exhaustion, smiled weakly at Shaq. He kneeled down to the girl's level, handing her the warm meal with an encouraging nod. "You like basketball?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded shyly. "Well, next time you come back, you tell me your favorite player, all right?" She grinned, clutching her food like a treasure. Moments like these made it all worth it. Across the street, inside a sleek, glass-walled office, a man named William Aldridge watched the scene unfold. His suit was sharp, his tie perfectly knotted, his eyes cold. A billionaire real estate mogul with a reputation for being ruthless, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. "Shaquille O'Neal," he murmured to himself, eyes narrowing as he watched the former NBA star interact with the crowd. His assistant, a nervous young man in an expensive blazer, cleared his throat. "Sir, the mayor's office confirmed they're reviewing your proposal for the redevelopment project. They're concerned about pushback. O'Neal's efforts have made that area very visible." William scoffed. "Pushback? From who? A bunch of vagrants and a retired athlete playing the hero? That neighborhood is a wasteland, and I intend to clean it up." The assistant hesitated. "O'Neal's influence is significant. He's beloved. If we start pushing, it could create bad press." William's expression darkened. "Then we push harder. That food truck, those giveaways, they make the problem worse. People linger, they settle, they expect handouts. If O'Neal wants to play savior, he can do it somewhere else. Make some calls, start shutting this down." Back at the food truck, Shaq continued handing out meals, oblivious to the storm brewing just across the street. A few volunteers rushed back and forth, refilling trays, stacking bottled waters, keeping the operation smooth. One of Shaq's longtime friends and partners in the charity, Darren Coleman, nudged him lightly. "You know, big man, you could be anywhere right now. Some island, a yacht, hell, even courtside at a Lakers game, but you keep showing up here." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head. "I'd rather be here." Darren smirked. Yeah, I know, 'cause it's the right thing to do." He exhaled, his tone growing more serious. "Look, man, word on the street is that some powerful folks ain't too happy with what you're doing. There's been talk." Shaq wiped his hands on a towel, his expression unreadable. "Talk? What kind of talk?" Darren glanced around, lowering his voice. "Permits getting pulled, City cracking down on food trucks in certain zones. Whole lot of new restrictions popping up out of nowhere. You know how these things work. Shaq's jaw tightened. He had seen it before. Wealthy developers eyeing neighborhoods like these, treating people like obstacles instead of human beings. He wasn't naive. The world still ran on money and influence, and some men would do anything to keep their power intact. "Let them come," Shaq finally said, his voice steady. "We're not stopping." Darren studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, but just know, this ain't gonna be easy." Shaq smiled, clapping a firm hand on his friend's shoulder. "Never is." As the sun began to set, the last few meals were handed out, and the food truck started packing up. Shaq stayed behind, talking to a few people, listening to their stories, making mental notes about who needed more help. A woman approached him hesitantly, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Mr. O'Neal, I just wanted to say, you saved me and my son. Last year we had nothing. Your meals gave us something to hold on to. And now, we're back on our feet. Thank you." Shaq placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did that. You got back up. I just gave a little help." She smiled, a tear escaping down her cheek, and walked away, disappearing into the city's evening rhythm. Shaq exhaled, looking up at the darkening sky. He felt at peace here, but deep down, he knew this peace wouldn't last. Somewhere out there, someone was watching, planning, and soon his kindness would be tested in ways he never imagined. William Aldridge sat in his high-rise office sipping a glass of scotch, his gaze fixed on the sprawling city below. Atlanta belonged to men like him, wealthy, powerful, and untouchable. From this height, everything looked orderly, pristine. But down in the streets, chaos festered like an infection. Homeless encampments, food trucks handing out free meals, people who refused to pull themselves up. A mess. And one man had made it worse. Shaquille O'Neal. William had seen the news clips, the feel-good stories, the public praise lavished on the former NBA giant for his so-called acts of kindness. Feeding the homeless, helping the poor. Nonsense. Charity only encouraged weakness. The strong survived, the weak didn't. That was the natural order. That was how he had built his empire, by eliminating weakness, by crushing obstacles. And now, Shaq had become one. His assistant, Jordan Hale, stood beside him, tablet in hand, eyes scanning the latest reports. "Mr. Aldridge, the mayor's office is hesitant to approve the next phase of the redevelopment plan. They're worried about community backlash." William's fingers tightened around his glass. "Because of O'Neal?" Jordan nodded. "His efforts are drawing attention. His presence in that neighborhood has made it harder to push people out. Protesters are showing up. Social media is painting him as a hero. It's complicating things." William exhaled slowly, setting his drink down. "Complications are temporary. Every man has a weakness, even a giant. We just have to find it." Jordan hesitated. "There's also another issue. The press. They're catching on to the rezoning efforts. Some are calling it legalized displacement. If this turns into a full-blown scandal..." William cut him off with a sharp look. "Then we make sure it doesn't." His mind was already working. He had dealt with obstacles before. Politicians, activists, whistleblowers. They all bent under the right pressure. Shaquille O'Neal would be no different. The next morning, William arrived at a private golf course, where deals were made behind the scenes, far from the eyes of the public. He met with Councilman Richard Hayes, a man whose loyalties shifted with the wind, so long as the price was right. "Richard," William greeted smoothly, shaking the man's hand. "We need to talk about this homeless situation." Hayes sighed, rubbing his temples. "William, you know how this works. The city has optics to consider. The people like Shaq. If we're too aggressive, it could backfire." William smirked, leaning in slightly. "That's why we make it look like he's the problem." Hayes frowned. "What do you mean?" "Shaq thinks he's saving these people. But what happens when the narrative shifts? When we show that his so-called help is actually creating more issues, crime, loitering, drug use? We push that story. Make the public question whether he's doing good or just making things worse." Hayes hesitated, but William knew the man was already considering it. "We have contacts in media," William continued. "We leak the right information. We make sure people see those streets as dangerous, overrun, and if the city cracks down, well, they're just restoring order." The councilman exhaled. "That's risky." William's smile was cold. "Only if we fail." A week later, the headlines started changing. Homeless camps surge in O'Neal's charity zones. Crime rates follow. Is Shaquille O'Neal's charity work enabling a bigger crisis? Business owners speak out. "We can't keep up with the loitering and drug use." It was all fabricated, exaggerated, paid reports, selective data. The real crime rates hadn't changed, but perception was everything, and perception could be controlled. On television, news anchors discussed the controversy of Shaq's work, bringing on so-called experts who questioned whether feeding the homeless actually solved anything or just made the problem worse. Social media influencers, conveniently aligned with William's interests, started raising concerns. William watched it unfold like a chess game, each piece moving exactly where he wanted. But Shaq didn't budge. Despite the pressure, the negative press, the sudden wave of city regulations tightening around food distribution, Shaq kept showing up, kept feeding people, kept standing tall. It was frustrating, and it meant William had to escalate. Jordan entered William's office late one evening, carrying a file. "Sir, we've uncovered something." William raised an eyebrow, setting his phone aside. "Go on." Jordan placed the file on the desk. Shaq has been quietly working with local businesses, funding housing projects, pushing for policy changes. He's not just feeding people, he's planning something bigger. If he succeeds, it could completely block your development plans. William's fingers drummed against his desk. This wasn't just some retired athlete playing philanthropist. Shaq was thinking long-term, changing the system. That was dangerous. Jordan continued, voice cautious. "There's also a former city official willing to talk. He claims Shaq has been bending rules, pulling favors with politicians, securing permits under the radar. It's all legal. But if we frame it the right way, we can make it look like corruption." William's lips curled into a slow smile. "Then let's do exactly that." The next wave of attacks came swiftly. Anonymous tips reached reporters. A high-profile interview suggested Shaq's charity had questionable financial dealings. City officials suddenly found irregularities in his permits. Investigations were launched. The media pounced. Is Shaquille O'Neal using his influence for personal gain? Community concerns grow over unregulated charity operations. William watched as the pressure mounted, waiting for the moment Shaq would crack. A scandal like this could ruin a man, even a beloved figure. But then, something unexpected happened. The people fought back. Local business owners, community leaders, even homeless individuals who had been helped by Shaq started speaking up. They countered every attack, sharing real stories, exposing the lies. Social media flooded with support for Shaq, turning William's narrative against him. And Shaq? He didn't defend himself with words. He kept working, kept feeding, kept standing. William clenched his jaw, watching the situation slip from his control. This wasn't over. Not yet. If Shaquille O'Neal wanted a battle, William would give him one. And this time he wouldn't play fair. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh bread and grilled meats as volunteers unloaded crates of food from trucks. Shaquille O'Neal stood in the middle of the lot, his massive frame casting a long shadow as he oversaw the preparations for the biggest food drive his charity had ever hosted. The event was meant to serve over 500 homeless individuals and struggling families, an effort fueled by his determination to create something bigger than just meals. This was about dignity, about reminding people they weren't forgotten. Excitement buzzed through the volunteers as tables were set, rows of hot meals carefully arranged, and tents erected for medical checkups and resource distribution. The neighborhood had come together for this. Small businesses had donated supplies. Local musicians had volunteered to play soft melodies, and community leaders had gathered to show their support. Then the cops arrived. A fleet of black and white squad cars rolled up to the scene, their red and blue lights flashing, even though no sirens blared. The joyful hum of the event dimmed into uneasy murmurs. Officers stepped out, their expressions hard, their presence imposing. One of them, a stiff-looking man with graying hair and a clipboard in hand, walked directly toward Shaq. "Mr. O'Neal," the officer said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "I need to see your permits for this event." Shaq's brow furrowed. "Permits? We've been doing this for months. Everything's cleared with the city." The officer didn't flinch. "Not anymore. Your permit has been revoked. You need to shut this down immediately." A hush fell over the crowd. Volunteers exchanged confused glances. People in line clutched their trays, as if afraid the food would be snatched away. Shaq crossed his arms over his chest, his towering presence making the officer shift slightly on his feet. "Revoked?" Shaq repeated, his voice calm but firm. "Since when?" The officer cleared his throat, flipping through his clipboard. "As of this morning, under new zoning restrictions. No unauthorized food distribution on public property without city council approval." Shaq exhaled through his nose, his jaw tightening. He knew exactly what this was. William Aldridge had finally made his move. Darren Coleman, Shaq's longtime friend and charity partner, stepped up beside him. "Come on, man, this is ridiculous. We've been following all the regulations. You can't just pull this at the last second." The officer sighed, as if tired of explaining. "Look, I don't make the rules. I enforce them. If you don't clear out in the next 30 minutes, we'll have to issue citations and impound any remaining supplies." Shaq clenched his fists. He glanced at the people still waiting in line, some already looking defeated, as if they had expected something like this. He hated that. He hated that they were used to being pushed aside. "Fine," Shaq finally said. "If public property is the issue, we'll move to private property. The parking lot behind the recreation center is owned by the community board. We got permission from them." The officer hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. It was a loophole he hadn't expected. "Let's go," Shaq called out, signaling to the volunteers. "Pack it up. We're moving locations." A small cheer rippled through the crowd, and just like that, the volunteers started shifting everything. The police watched, but didn't interfere. They couldn't. Not yet. Moving the food drive should have solved the problem. It didn't. That evening, as the last meals were handed out and the volunteers cleaned up, word began spreading that something was happening downtown. Homeless individuals who had been gathering in usual spots, the park, under the overpass, near the shelters, were suddenly being forced out. Private security teams, wearing dark uniforms with no official city badges, had started clearing them away. Some were told to move along. Others had their few belongings tossed into garbage trucks. The city's homeless weren't just being ignored anymore. They were being erased. Shaq drove through the streets that night, his hands gripping the wheel tighter with every block. He had seen injustice before. But this was calculated. This was coordinated. He pulled up to the community shelter he had been working with for months, only to find several of the people he had served earlier now sitting on the sidewalk, looking lost. An older man named Leonard, a Vietnam veteran who had been on the streets for years, looked up at Shaq as he stepped out of his car. "They came in quick," Leonard muttered, shaking his head. "Didn't say much. Just told us we had to go. Said the city's cracking down on vagrancy." Shaq's blood boiled. This wasn't just a random sweep. This was William Aldridge pulling strings, using private security firms to do what the police couldn't get away with. Darren arrived a few minutes later, his phone still in his hand, anger flashing in his eyes. "I got calls from 3 different shelters. Same story. Cops aren't doing this. It's private contractors. You know what that means." Shaq exhaled sharply. "William." Darren nodded. "Yeah, and he's got the mayor's office backing him. Nobody's saying it outright, but you can tell." Shaq turned to look at Leonard and the others who had been displaced. His mind raced. They needed somewhere safe, somewhere they couldn't be chased out of. "The church," he said suddenly. "Pastor Jenkins, he's got space in the community hall." Darren nodded. "I'll make the call." Shaq turned back to Leonard. "Hang tight, big man. We'll get you somewhere safe tonight." Leonard gave a weary smile. "Appreciate it, Shaq, but you know this ain't gonna stop, right?" Shaq knew, and he wasn't planning on backing down. The next morning, Shaq walked into City Hall, his presence impossible to ignore. He wasn't just a retired basketball player now. He was a problem for the people in power who wanted to keep the status quo intact. As he stepped into the office of the city commissioner, he found himself face to face with a man who looked more nervous than authoritative. Commissioner Brian Leland, a man whose job depended on keeping wealthy donors happy, adjusted his tie and gestured for Shaq to sit. Shaq didn't. "I want to know why my permits got pulled," Shaq said, his voice measured but firm. "And I want to know why people are getting thrown out of the only places they have left." Leland sighed, rubbing his temples. "Shaq, look, this isn't personal. The city has policies. We have to follow certain guidelines and—" "Cut the crap," Shaq interrupted. "This is about Aldridge, isn't it?" Leland hesitated. That was answer enough. Shaq leaned forward, resting both massive hands on the desk. "You know what's right. You know what's happening is wrong. But you're letting it happen anyway." Leland swallowed hard. "I can't go against the mayor's office, Shaq. This isn't about you. It's about development, economic growth." Shaq let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You think pushing people onto the streets is economic growth?" Leland lowered his gaze. He had no real answer. Shaq straightened, taking a deep breath. "This isn't over," he said simply. Then he turned and walked out, leaving the commissioner sitting in silence. Outside, Darren was waiting. "Well," Shaq's expression was set. "They're scared, but they're still going to do what Aldridge wants." Darren sighed. "So what now?" Shaq looked out over the city. He had spent his whole life fighting on the court. But this was a different kind of fight. "Now," he said, "we push back." Shaq pulled his hoodie over his head and stepped out of his car. He had always been larger than life, on the court, in business, even in the way he helped others. But now, he had to move in the shadows. The city had cracked down hard, shutting down every food drive, closing every loophole, and ensuring that anyone who tried to help the homeless met resistance. That didn't mean Shaq was done. Darren sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through his phone. "You sure about this, big man?" he asked. "We're really just going to go guerrilla style with this?" Shaq glanced over at his friend. "You got a better idea?" Darren sighed. "Nope. Just making sure you know what you're doing." Shaq didn't answer. He popped the trunk, revealing dozens of bags filled with food and bottled water. He and a few close volunteers had been working through the night, cooking, packing, and organizing. If they couldn't feed people in one place, they would do it in several, small, scattered locations, moving fast and keeping a step ahead of the authorities. "All right," Shaq said, stretching his massive arms. "Let's get to work." By noon, Shaq's name was trending. Videos had begun circulating, him handing out meals in alleys, at bus stations, outside emergency shelters. People recorded his efforts, uploading clips with captions like, "They tried to stop him. He didn't stop." And then, the stories started rolling in. "Shaq fed my family when we had nowhere else to go. I lost my job, my home, and my hope, until this man reminded me that people still care. They shut down his charity. So he's bringing it straight to the people." Within hours, hashtags emerged. "Stand with Shaq." "Let him feed." "People over profit." The response was electric. Celebrities retweeted his videos. Athletes, actors, musicians, they all started speaking up. A well-known journalist even dedicated an entire segment to the crackdown, calling it the most blatant example of the rich silencing the good. Shaq scrolled through his phone, watching the momentum build. Darren, standing beside him, whistled. "Man, we might have just flipped the script." Shaq exhaled, knowing this was just the beginning. "Maybe, but we're not done yet." That evening, a city council member named Lisa Remington held a press conference. "This is not about laws or regulations," she said, her voice steady but firm. "This is about a billionaire using his influence to crush a man who is trying to do good. I cannot, in good conscience, stay silent while this happens in my city." William Aldridge watched the broadcast from his office, his grip tightening around his glass. This was not part of the plan. His assistant, Jordan, hesitated before speaking. "Sir, we're losing ground. Public support is shifting. Even some of our allies on the council are wavering. William's jaw tightened. Then remind them where their funding comes from. Jordan hesitated. And if that doesn't work? William's expression darkened. Then we take this to the next level. It was past midnight when Shaq's phone buzzed with an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something told him to answer. A voice came through the speaker, low, urgent. You need to be careful. Shaq frowned. Who is this? You don't need to know my name, the voice continued. But I know what's happening, and I know what's coming. Shaq sat up straight, now fully alert. What do you mean? The voice hesitated. Then, in a slow, deliberate tone, it said, Aldridge isn't just trying to stop you. He's trying to bury you. The call ended. Shaq stared at his phone, his heartbeat steady but heavy. He had expected resistance. He had expected attacks. But now something bigger was at play, and he needed to be ready. The rain drizzled over the city as Shaq sat in his car, staring at the dimly lit office building ahead. He had been following a trail of rumors, whispers about William Aldridge's real intentions. Every instinct told him this was bigger than just a rich man trying to flex his power. Something was off, and he was about to find out what. Darren sat in the passenger seat, flipping through a stack of papers. So let me get this straight, he said, shaking his head. Aldridge ain't just trying to get rid of the homeless. He's trying to buy the whole damn district? Shaq exhaled, gripping the steering wheel. Not trying. He's already in the process. He just needs one thing to happen first. Darren scanned the documents again, his eyes narrowing. He needs the area cleared. Shaq nodded. No homeless, no protests, no charity work slowing him down. Once that happens, he gets his luxury condos approved, turns a massive profit, and moves on like none of this ever happened. Darren let out a low whistle. Man's playing chess while we were playing checkers. Shaq wasn't in the mood for metaphors. He had spent weeks fighting what he thought was just a personal vendetta against his charity work. But this was about greed. Power. Aldridge didn't just want Shaq out of the way. He wanted to erase every trace of the community that had existed long before he set his sights on it. Shaq glanced at the office building again. Inside, a city planner named Greg Holland was waiting for him. Greg had been on the zoning committee for years, someone who had quietly approved dozens of real estate deals without much noise. But something about this one had made him uneasy. Shaq checked his phone. 1:37 a.m. Let's go, he said. Greg Holland looked nervous, his fingers tapping anxiously against the desk as Shaq and Darren entered the dimly lit office. He was a small man, glasses slipping down his nose, the type who had spent too many years drowning in bureaucracy. You didn't get followed, right? Greg asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Shaq shook his head. I don't move like that. Greg nodded quickly, then reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a thick folder. He slid it across the desk. This is everything, he said. Emails, contract drafts, internal memos. It's all there. Shaq opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. Permits fast-tracked. Zoning restrictions waived. Campaign donations made to key officials. And then, the real bombshell. A direct order from Aldridge's office to shut down all community-based operations in the area. This is how he's doing it, Greg said. He's not just pulling favors. He's buying people, cops, inspectors, even judges. He's making sure that when the time comes, no one will be left to fight back. Darren rubbed his temples. Man, this is worse than we thought. Shaq looked up at Greg. Why are you telling me this? Greg swallowed. Because it's wrong. I've worked in this system for years, and I've looked the other way more times than I can count. But this is deliberate. This is wiping people out for profit. I can't be part of that. Shaq closed the folder, his expression unreadable. He had what he needed. Now he just had to decide what to do with it. The next day, Shaq woke up to a pounding on his front door. He barely had time to throw on a hoodie before opening it to find two uniformed officers standing on his porch. Shaquille O'Neal, one of them asked, his voice clipped and professional. Shaq folded his arms. Yeah. The officer handed him a notice. You're being ordered to cease all unauthorized community activities. Failure to comply will result in legal action. Shaq scanned the paper. It was vague, full of legal jargon meant to sound official, but he knew exactly what this was, a scare tactic. "You serious right now?" Shaq said, looking between them. The second officer, a younger man who looked uncomfortable, cleared his throat. "We're just following orders." Shaq let out a humorless chuckle. "Whose orders?" Neither cop answered. Shaq took a step closer, towering over both of them. "You gonna arrest me for feeding people?" The younger cop looked away, but the first one held his ground. "We don't want trouble, Mr. O'Neal. Just do yourself a favor and step back." Shaq didn't move. He had spent his life facing opponents on the court, but this was different. This was real power at work, the kind that didn't play fair. "Tell your boss," Shaq said, his voice low and steady. "I don't scare easy." The officers exchanged a look before walking away. Shaq closed the door, his jaw clenched. Aldridge wasn't just tightening the screws, he was making his move. By the time Shaq got to his office, Darren was already waiting, his laptop open. "Man, it's worse than we thought," he said, motioning Shaq over. On the screen was a leaked report detailing the city's urban renewal initiative, the fancy term for pushing out lower-income residents in favor of luxury developments. And at the center of it, Aldridge's company. "This isn't just about us," Darren said. "This is citywide. The only reason we're a problem is because you're in the way." Shaq exhaled. "So we go public." Darren nodded. "We've got enough dirt to blow this wide open. If we move fast, we can hit them where it hurts, before they have time to spin it." Shaq's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "They know what you have. Be careful who you trust." Shaq stared at the message, his mind racing. This wasn't just about fighting back anymore. This was about survival. Something wasn't right. He could feel it. His charity's momentum had rattled William Aldridge's empire, and now the counterpunch was coming. He just didn't know from where. Darren was already inside, pacing near the coffee machine, his phone glued to his ear. "No, that doesn't make sense," he said sharply. "We double-checked the permits. There's no way—" He stopped mid-sentence, turning to Shaq. His face was tight with frustration. Shaq raised an eyebrow. "What now?" Darren hung up and ran a hand over his face. "City just revoked our permit for the next event. Something about public disturbance concerns." Shaq clenched his jaw. "That's the third one this week." Darren nodded grimly. "And it gets worse. There's a noise complaint filed against the shelter we partnered with. And health inspectors? They suddenly decided to re-evaluate our kitchen's licensing." Shaq exhaled, frustration simmering beneath his skin. This wasn't coincidence. This was Aldridge tightening the screws, piece by piece. Before he could respond, the front doors swung open. Lisa Remington, the city council member who had been supporting Shaq's cause, stormed in, her expression clouded with urgency. "We have a problem," she said, dropping a thick folder onto the table. A big one. Shaq opened it, his eyes scanning the documents inside. His stomach turned. It was a lawsuit, filed against him personally. The charges: disturbing public order, unauthorized occupation of city property, and obstruction of government operations. Shaq frowned. "This is insane." Lisa shook her head. "No, it's calculated. Aldridge pulled strings to make this happen. The city's treating your charity work like a criminal enterprise." Darren muttered a curse under his breath. "They're trying to bury you, big man." Shaq set the papers down carefully. "We fight it." Lisa hesitated. "That's not all." She pulled out a second folder. This one was worse. A whistleblower from Shaq's own team had come forward. Someone inside his organization was claiming that Shaq had been misusing donations, running an unregulated operation with potential financial discrepancies. Shaq stiffened. "Who?" Lisa hesitated before sliding a printed statement toward him. The name at the bottom made his heart sink. Dwayne Jacobs, one of Shaq's closest friends. Dwayne had been with Shaq since the beginning. A former college teammate turned business consultant, he had helped manage logistics for the charity. He had always been there, always had Shaq's back. Or so Shaq had thought. Now his name was signed at the bottom of a statement accusing Shaq of financial mismanagement. Shaq read it 3 times, willing the words to change. Darren sat down, shaking his head. Man, I can't believe this. Lisa sighed. He gave an exclusive interview to a major news outlet. It airs tonight. Shaq closed the folder. His pulse was steady, but his chest felt tight. This was personal. He sold me out, he said, voice low. Lisa hesitated. Maybe he was pressured. No, Shaq cut in. He made a choice. Darren exhaled sharply. And now we have one to make. By the evening, Shaq's name was all over the news. Shaquille O'Neal accused of running unregulated charity operation. Exclusive. Former insider alleges financial misconduct. Is Big Shaq more than just a philanthropist? New lawsuit raises questions. News anchors debated whether Shaq had crossed the line from charity work into something reckless. Pundits speculated about his intentions. And then, Dwayne's face appeared on a primetime news segment. I never wanted to come forward, Dwayne said, shaking his head solemnly. But I saw things that didn't add up. I just couldn't stay silent anymore. Shaq watched from his office, his fists clenched. Dwayne's words had just enough truth to sound credible, but they were twisted, manipulated. I respect Shaq, Dwayne continued. I always have. But good intentions don't excuse breaking the rules. Shaq turned off the TV. The damage was done. Darren sat across from him, rubbing his temples. Man, we knew Aldridge was coming for us, but this is next level. Shaq exhaled slowly. They want to make me look reckless, make me look like a fraud. That way nobody listens when I expose Aldridge. Lisa folded her arms. And it's working. Public opinion is shifting. Some of your biggest supporters are backing off. They don't want to be associated with a scandal. Shaq leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. This was the moment Aldridge wanted. The moment Shaq would be forced to choose between his reputation and his mission. If he backed down now, the attacks would stop. The lawsuit would quietly disappear. His name would be cleared. But the people he had been fighting for? They'd be left in the cold. Darren watched him carefully. What's the move, big man? Shaq sat up, his expression hardening. We fight. Lisa raised an eyebrow. That's going to get messy. Shaq nodded. Then let's get messy. That night, Shaq made a call. The voice on the other end picked up after 2 rings. I figured you'd be calling, the voice said. Shaq leaned against the window watching the city lights. You still got those connections? A chuckle. You really think I ever lost them? Shaq exhaled. I need to go on the offensive. I need every piece of dirt on Aldridge you can find. There was a pause. Then, meet me tomorrow. And bring everything you've got. Shaq hung up, turning back to Darren. We're not just fighting back, Shaq said. We're taking them down. The tension in Shaq's office was thick enough to cut with a knife. The lights were dimmed, the air buzzing with the weight of what had happened over the past few days. His name dragged through the mud, a lawsuit looming over him. And worst of all, Dwayne's betrayal playing over and over again on every major news outlet. Darren leaned against the desk, arms crossed. We need a break, man. Something. Anything. Shaq exhaled deeply, staring at the documents sprawled across the table. They had enough proof that Aldridge was manipulating the system, but the lawsuit had put them on the defensive. Every time they tried to go public with evidence, the media buried it under the latest Shaq scandal headlines. Lisa Remington checked her phone and sighed. The mayor's office just released another statement. They're reviewing the claims against you, but won't intervene. Which means Aldridge still has them in his pocket. Shaq leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. We're fighting with both hands tied. Darren's phone buzzed. He frowned at the screen. This is weird. Shaq looked up. What? Darren hesitated. Someone wants to meet, tonight. Says they have information that could turn this whole thing around. Lisa's eyes narrowed. Who? Darren glanced at Shaq before answering. Elliot Grayson. Shaq's jaw tightened. He knew that name. The industrial district of Atlanta wasn't a place Shaq often found himself. But here he was, sitting in the back of an old warehouse, waiting. The space smelled of oil and dust, the hum of distant machinery filling the silence. Darren paced beside him. You sure about this? Elliot Grayson ain't exactly known for his honesty. Lisa adjusted her blazer. He's not known for loyalty either, but if he's turning against Aldridge, it means something. Elliot Grayson was a name Shaq hadn't heard in years, a ruthless businessman who once played in the same elite circles as Aldridge. He had built his empire on real estate, investments, and backroom deals. But a falling out with Aldridge years ago had pushed him out of the game. Tonight, he had asked for a meeting. A door creaked open, and Elliot stepped inside. Dressed in a sleek gray suit, the man looked every bit as polished as he had in his prime, except now, there was something different in his eyes. A sharpness, a grudge. "Shaq," Elliot said, nodding in greeting. "Been a long time." Shaq didn't stand. He just watched. "Let's skip the small talk. What do you want?" Elliot smirked, walking toward the table. "Straight to business. I like that." He pulled a slim folder from his coat and placed it in front of Shaq. "Consider this my contribution to your little war against Aldridge." Shaq glanced at Darren before picking up the folder. He flipped it open, eyes narrowing at what he saw. Bank records, private emails, real estate contracts. It took only a few seconds to see the pattern. Lisa's breath hitched. This is Aldridge's entire operation." Elliot leaned against the table. Not the whole thing, but enough to sink him. Darren snatched a page and let out a low whistle. "Man's been laundering money through shell companies to bribe officials." Shaq turned to Elliot, skeptical. "Why are you doing this?" Elliot chuckled, crossing his arms. "Let's just say I've been waiting for the right opportunity to get back at Aldridge. You're making it very easy for me." Shaq studied him. He didn't trust the man, not fully, but the evidence was real, and it was exactly what they needed. Lisa tapped a page. "If we release this, it'll flip the entire conversation. The media will have no choice but to cover it." Shaq closed the folder. "Then let's make sure it hits hard." The next morning, the headlines changed. Breaking. Leaked documents reveal William Aldridge's corrupt land deals. Atlanta mogul under investigation for political bribery. Real estate scandal rocks City Hall. News stations scrambled to keep up. The very outlets that had smeared Shaq now had no choice but to report on Aldridge's secret dealings. Lisa arranged for the documents to be reviewed by an independent investigative journalist, ensuring that the exposure couldn't be buried. Within hours, politicians who had once backed Aldridge began distancing themselves. Aldridge, once untouchable, was suddenly vulnerable. But the war wasn't over. Aldridge wasn't a man who accepted defeat easily. By that evening, he appeared on a primetime news interview, calm, collected, spinning the narrative like only a seasoned manipulator could. "This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to distract from the real issue," Aldridge said smoothly. "Shaquille O'Neal has been caught running an unregulated operation, and now he's lashing out with baseless accusations." The anchor, clearly uncomfortable, pressed him. "But Mr. Aldridge, these documents suggest a pattern of financial misconduct." Aldridge chuckled. "Documents leaked by a known rival of mine, a man who has been trying to ruin me for years. This is a smear campaign, plain and simple." Shaq watched the interview in his office, fists clenched. Aldridge was slippery, and he still had connections in the media who were willing to spin the truth. Darren muted the screen. "Man's good at lying, I'll give him that." Lisa sat back. "We need something stronger, something he can't deny." Shaq thought for a moment. Then, an idea struck him. Aldridge thrived in the shadows. It was time to drag him into the light. The following day, Shaq held a press conference. Not in a fancy hotel or behind a polished podium, but in the heart of the community Aldridge had tried to erase. He stood in front of the rec center, flanked by community leaders, shelter workers, and the very people Aldridge had been trying to push out. "This fight isn't just about me," Shaq said into the microphones. "It's about all of us. It's about the families who've been forced out, the small businesses that have been crushed, and the people who've been treated like they don't belong in their own city." He lifted the folder of evidence. "William Aldridge wants you to believe this is a distraction, but this," he held it up, "is the truth." The cameras flashed. The crowd cheered. Shaq looked directly into the lenses, knowing Aldridge was watching. "You've spent your life hiding behind power and money," Shaq said. But now? Now you answer to the people. The press conference dominated the news. The battle wasn't over. But for the first time, Aldridge was on the ropes. The tension in the television studio was suffocating. Bright lights illuminated the stage, casting sharp shadows on the two men seated across from each other. The network had promoted this debate for days. Shaquille O'Neal versus William Aldridge, live on national television. 1 million viewers tuned in, eager to watch the final battle between the man who had dedicated his life to helping the homeless and the tycoon, accused of trying to erase them. Shaq sat still, his massive frame composed, his eyes locked on William. Across from him, William Aldridge wore the expression of a man who still believed he had control. He adjusted his cufflinks with practiced ease, forcing a tight smile as the cameras panned to him. The moderator, a seasoned journalist named Evelyn Carter, looked between them before speaking. "Gentlemen, thank you for being here tonight. Mr. Aldridge, I'd like to start with you. In light of the recent documents exposing financial irregularities in your development projects, do you still maintain that your actions were lawful?" Aldridge's smile barely wavered. "Absolutely," he said smoothly. "These accusations are nothing more than a distraction. My company has always operated with integrity, and the so-called evidence against me is nothing but a desperate attempt to undermine the real issue here, Mr. O'Neal's illegal activities." Shaq leaned forward slightly, his deep voice cutting through the studio like a blade. "You're calling feeding the homeless illegal?" Aldridge barely hesitated. "When it disrupts public order, yes." A murmur rippled through the audience. Shaq shook his head, his frustration evident. "Public order? You mean your order, the one where only rich folks get to live in this city, and everyone else gets pushed out." Evelyn Carter interjected, "Mr. O'Neal, your supporters have claimed that Mr. Aldridge's development projects are displacing entire communities. What evidence do you have to support that?" Shaq exhaled and lifted a folder, just like he had at the press conference. "I brought receipts." The cameras zoomed in as he pulled out a stack of signed contracts, emails, and internal memos from Aldridge's own company. "This," Shaq said, holding up a highlighted document, "is proof that Aldridge bribed city officials to fast-track his luxury condo projects while shutting down shelters and food programs." Evelyn leaned forward. "And where did you obtain these documents?" Shaq glanced toward the crowd. "From people who finally decided to stop being afraid." Aldridge scoffed. "Oh, please. You expect the public to believe that a retired basketball player suddenly became an investigative journalist?" Shaq's expression hardened. "I expect them to believe the truth. And the truth is, you don't care about this city. You care about your bottom line. You call what I do a public disturbance, but you were willing to tear down entire neighborhoods just to make a few billion more." A hush fell over the audience. Aldridge's smug exterior cracked just for a second, his fingers tightening against the armrest of his chair. Shaq turned to the cameras. "And let's talk about why. Let's talk about why you really hate what I'm doing." Aldridge straightened. "Careful, O'Neal." Shaq didn't blink. "You're not just a greedy businessman. You're a racist." The audience gasped. Aldridge's face turned red, but Shaq didn't stop. "You don't just want the homeless gone. You want black and brown families pushed out. You want Atlanta to belong to people who look like you, people who think like you. That's why you're scared of me. Because I'm not just feeding people. I'm making sure they stay." A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Aldridge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Evelyn Carter, sensing the shift in power, turned back to Aldridge. "Do you have a response?" Aldridge forced a smile, but there was no charm behind it now. "This is absurd. Race has nothing to do with my business decisions." Shaq tilted his head. "Then why do your developments only happen in historically black communities? Why do your company's emails talk about removing undesirables before starting construction?" Evelyn turned sharply to Aldridge. "Is that true?" Aldridge opened his mouth, closed it. He glanced toward his PR manager, standing off stage, but the damage had already been done. The audience wasn't on his side anymore. Within hours, the internet exploded. Aldridge Exposed trended worldwide. Clips of the debate flooded social media. News stations replayed Shaq's words over and over. By morning, it got worse for Aldridge. The mayor's office released a statement cutting all ties with him. The city council launched an emergency ethics investigation into his company. 2 high-ranking officials resigned. And then, the real blow came. His investors pulled out. By noon, Aldridge's empire began to crumble. His stock value plummeted. Board members resigned in droves. And the city, once his playground, suddenly wanted nothing to do with him. Shaq watched it all unfold from his office. Darren scrolled through his phone, shaking his head. Man, it's like watching a skyscraper collapse in real time. Lisa smirked. Couldn't have happened to a better guy. Shaq leaned back, exhaling. He's not done yet, he warned. Men like Aldridge don't just disappear. Lisa nodded. Number. But they lose power. And right now, that's exactly what's happening. By the end of the week, city officials fully reinstated Shaq's charity programs. Not only that, they introduced new policies protecting homeless communities from forced removal. Grants were issued to build permanent housing instead of tearing it down. Public sentiment had shifted, and in the heart of it all, Shaq stood victorious. On the night of the city's first fully approved food drive since the lawsuit, Shaq walked through the crowd, shaking hands, laughing with kids, sharing meals. The battle had been brutal, but the people had won. Leonard, the Vietnam veteran Shaq had helped weeks ago, clapped him on the back. Told you it wasn't going to be easy. Shaq chuckled. Worth it, though. As he looked out at the streets, now filled with life, he realized something. Aldridge had tried to erase these people. Instead, they were stronger than ever. And Shaq? He wasn't just an athlete. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a force. And he wasn't stopping anytime soon. The city felt different now. Where once there had been tension, uncertainty, and fear, now there was hope. The people Shaq had fought for, the homeless, the struggling families, the ones pushed to the fringes of society, were no longer invisible. They weren't just surviving. They were rebuilding. Shaq walked through the same streets where his charity trucks had once been shut down. Only this time, there were no cops threatening to issue citations. No security teams forcing people to scatter. Instead, there were new beginnings. Across the neighborhood, construction crews worked on newly approved housing projects. City officials, under pressure from the public, had finally allocated funding to provide long-term support for displaced families. Community centers that had once been at risk of demolition were now getting renovations. And Shaq? He was still here, still walking these streets, still showing up. William Aldridge had disappeared from the public eye. After the debate, after the investigations, after his business empire crumbled, he had no choice but to step down from his company. His assets were frozen, his political allies had abandoned him, and the name Aldridge was now synonymous with greed and corruption. Shaq wasn't the type to celebrate another man's downfall, but as he walked past what used to be Aldridge's sleek corporate headquarters, now an empty shell of a building, its windows dark, its offices vacant, he couldn't help but feel the weight of victory. Not for himself, for the people. The community center parking lot buzzed with energy. It was the biggest food drive they had ever done. No restrictions, no interference. Just people, coming together, helping each other the way it was always meant to be. Shaq stood behind a long table, handing out meals with the same ease and warmth as he always had. A woman approached him, holding her son's hand. She hesitated before speaking. Mr. O'Neal, you don't know me, but a year ago my family was homeless. You helped us. And now... She swallowed hard, smiling. Now we have a place of our own. My husband found work. My son is in school again. Shaq looked down at the young boy who clutched a basketball against his chest. You play? He asked. The boy grinned. Yeah, I'm learning. Shaq knelt to his level. Keep practicing. And remember, the real game ain't about points. It's about how you help people. The boy nodded, beaming. Darren clapped Shaq on the shoulder. You seeing this, big man? This is what it was all for. Shaq exhaled, looking around at the hundreds of people gathered. The volunteers, the families, the faces that had once been forgotten but were now finally seen. Yeah, he said, nodding. It was worth it. Later that evening, as the last of the food trucks packed up and volunteers started heading home, Shaq stood alone for a moment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. Lisa walked up beside him. "You're not stopping, are you?" Shaq smirked. "You know me better than that." She chuckled. "Good, because this city still needs you." Shaq nodded. He knew his fight wasn't over. There would always be another battle to fight, another person to help, another system that needed to change. But tonight, he had proven that kindness was more powerful than greed, that no amount of money or power could silence the truth forever. And most of all, that when you stand for what's right, the world will stand with you. As he walked to his car, Shaq's phone buzzed with a message. "Unknown number. You did good, O'Neal. But stay ready. The fight never ends." Shaq read it once, then smiled. He already knew that. And he was ready for whatever came next. The fight for justice doesn't end here. Communities thrive when people stand up, speak out, and refuse to back down. Want to be part of real change? Support local charities, advocate for housing rights, and stand with those making a difference. Because when we lift others up, we all rise together.